My name is Stuart Graham. Unfortunately, I'm 68-year-old now. Was a draftsman for 10 years with the Motherwell-based company Alexander Findlay Company Limited, and they were based in Parknewt Street in Motherwell, just behind Parknewt Street Primary School. The drawing office in Findlay's at that time had maybe 30 to 35 draftsmen, and every year they would employ 5 to 6 new trainees, which I just cannot imagine businesses are along the similar lines to Findlay's doing that in 2025. So we split up, 3 went into one office, 3 next doors. They're kind of an L-shaped building, an L-shaped drawing office. You're then, in the first few months, you're not doing any work that's going to be used by the company. You're literally given drawings that the senior men have drawn, and it's to improve your penmanship, see how neat it was. Some was, it was neat, others, it was terrible. It does improve. One draftsman said to one of the apprentices that there's only 2 man-made objects you can see for the moon, the Great Wall of China and his printing, because it was so dark. As a trainee, you didn't use the harder lead pencils. It was HB, sometimes an H, so it's pretty soft. And you would smudge it over the tracing paper, which we used to practice on. As you got more experience, you were using 4 and 5H leaded pencils, which I have one here. I still have my very first one, a propelling pencil, which, if you're not my age, a lot of you won't know what a propelling lead pencil is, but that pencil can be used for any changeable lead you wanted to use for your drawings. The other piece of historic, this was the equivalent of a calculator. In the early days, we didn't have calculators, and that's in the mid-70s. The drawing office, everything was done by slide rule, so all your calculations were done by using a slide rule. Back in the mid-70s, we didn't have calculators in the drawing office, or I don't remember any appearing at that period. It could have been late 70s before they did. So all your calculations, measurements, were done using a slide rule. If you ask me to use this now, I've got no idea, haven't a clue, but everything was done using a slide rule. Steel tonnage, calculations for the number of bolts you would use in a joint, the amount of weld you would use, all done by slide rule. When you're doing the actual drawing, this was your scale ruler, which, if I can remember, has 8 different scales. And that's what you would use for your drawing work with your 5, 6H lead pencil. Once you'd completed the drawing, you'd then go over it using an ink pen. These came with different size nibs. 0.1 I think was the smallest, 0.15, 0.2, 0.3, 3.5, up to 0.5 and 0.7. Depending on the object you were drawing, that decided or determined what size of nib you would use. The thicker pen was usually for your borders, main objects, titles. Smaller nibs for fine detail, dimension lines and arrowheads. Once your drawing was complete, depending on what you were drawing, it could take anything between 3 days, maybe a week. You had the AO original tracing paper, that was your master. It would be taken into the print room, where at that time there was 2 girls who worked in the print room. They would make a paper copy of that tracing. That tracing was then stored safely and used if required sometime in the future for future use for repeated copies. But one copy was printed off, given to a draftsman, a senior draftsman, who would check your work, and the famous red pencil would come out. He would mark all the errors or mistakes or alterations he wanted to be made on that with that red pencil on your drawing paper. You would get it back, get the tracing paper back out, make the alterations, and believe it or not, how to make the alteration, how to change a figure, a size, a dimension on tracing paper was by using a razor blade. The old, I don't even know what they're called, just an old razor blade. You had individual blades. Your grandfather would buy in a pack of 5 or 10. Use the razor blade vertically and very gently scrape the ink off the tracing paper. You then use the blue part of a hard rubber, which brought back the smooth surface of the tracing paper, and then you then made the alteration that the checker or the chief draftsman required for your drawing. Once that was done, so many copies were printed off, given to the guys in the order department. They would order the steelwork, the steel fork, the steel part, the number of angles, beams, columns, joists, bolts. More copies were made, sent down to workshop floor, and you never saw it again, unless you had made such a mistake that usually when the foreman would come up to see the chief draftsman to say that the welder physically can't get his hand and his welding rod into the gap that you had left for him to weld inside a joint. That happened, not often, but that did happen. Just a lack of experience on the individual draftsman, or just an oversight on the checker. So that was your basic equipment. There was set squares, drawing board. The drawing board was in a pedestal, hydraulic operated pedal. The board would rise, thankfully for my height. It all could tilt different angles, because after standing at a board, you did have a raisable, adjustable bench or seat, stool, but sometimes you had to stand up to get to any alterations or any writing you wanted at the top of the drawing, so the board had to be tilted to suit your angle that you were leaning to use the pens on. That was your job, in the office, 8 till 4 or half 8 till 5 o'clock, I think were the hours. At that time, Findlay's had work all over, definitely over the UK, possibly at that time still doing work abroad. Prior to me joining, my uncle worked on the shop floor, and he remembers them doing work for bridges in India and Burma. My uncle Bobby was called Robert Bruce, and believe it or not, his best friends in school, primary, senior and into Findlay's in the workshop floor, was a chap called William Wallace. So he had Robert Bruce and William Wallace working beside each other on the shop floor. And I say they did jobs for India, South America. But at my time, Findlay's concentrated mainly in power stations, anything from Kilroot to Northern Ireland, Inverkip, Peterhead, St Fergus up the northeast coast towards kind of Peterhead, Aberdeenshire area, mostly for the oil sea gas pipelines. We also worked on Drax Power Station down in Yorkshire. That work would keep Findlay's and draftsmen employed for years. I mean, I can remember working on Kilroot to Northern Ireland drawings for close to 2 years. But towards the late 70s, 80s, a lot of firms similar to Findlay's, like Motherwell Bridgeworks, they changed their idea, the production idea. Findlay's was always based on H-shaped beams, whether it be a column, a joist or angles, but that was the main steel used were H-frame beams and joists. If I can remember correctly, the North Sea oil work relied on a lot of tubular steel. There was the first big layoff of voluntary redundancies at Findlay's. I can't remember the exact figure, but obviously they asked all the departments, anyone wishing to volunteer for redundancies, some of the senior men who'd been there for a long time, they accepted the payoff. One chap was my chief checker, wee Willie Marsh, and wee Willie was wee Willie because he was only 5 foot tall, 5'2". And the strange thing about Willie, when he worked in Findlay's as a trainee draftsman, he worked in the old office round the corner. The new office hadn't been built, but that was where his tenement house was. When the house knocked down, Willie moved round the corner, the new drawing office was built. Willie moved back into that new drawing office, and it turned out the window he was sitting at with his drawing board was the exact same level and window and view that he had from his bedroom window growing up as a kid. Willie took voluntary redundancy, one or two others did. The younger ones moved to other companies. So around about 1981, again, more redundancies were asked for. They got them. And then in 1983 was really the big shock to a lot of us when they realised it wasn't just a couple of dozen. They were looking at 3 figures, maybe 100 out of 375 staff were going to have to move. So I had applied for other jobs, and round about October '83 I was accepted reluctantly, or they accepted my request to be made redundant voluntarily. But I didn't regret it. It had to happen, but I didn't want to leave the drawing office because that had been close to 9 years. I loved my job. Made better the fact that two of my fellow draftsmen were former Motherwell players, and as a Motherwell fan, I just loved hearing the stories of particularly one of them talking about the Ansel Babes that he used to play with. The younger one played with Motherwell reserves. Eventually, they left, I left, and I went back to Findlay's a couple of years later after I'd left. Just a skeleton staff, half a dozen draftsmen, and at that point they were quoting for contracts for cattle grids and extensions to a cattle showroom. Now a car showroom, half a dozen columns, some beams. A draftsman's worked for a day. Cattle grids from 30 to 40,000 ton power stations. That is a big change. This is an example of the work that I did as a draftsman. This is a AO size drawing sheet showing two girders for Torness Power Station, which threw in Lothings or East Lothings. This was for the control building. There were different parts. There was the boiler house, the turbine house. But this was maybe a day and a half's work. So that was a day and a half I spent on it. Once the chief draftsman checker had a look at it and made his alterations, the amendments. He could add on another half day. Out would come the razor blade, scraping away the original tracing, the errors or the changes and alterations that he wanted to make. But that's just typical. That was, this might even be, it might be dated. It should be dated. It's not yet been checked, so it doesn't have it has my name printed. But one of the things that a lot of the draftsmen learned or were encouraged to do was have a special signature, just something unusual. And believe it or not, I have one and still use it to this day. And because a lot of the drawing work was done in pencil or ink pens, I have never joined up words since I left high school. Everything I have written has been printed. To this day, I print everything. As you can see, all your writing on a drawing had to be printed. This is an elevation of Drax Power Station down in Yorkshire. This was one of the early drawings that the drawing office would produce. It was really just to give most draftsmen a rough idea of what the site looked like. But this one was drawn for all these cranes to show the workshops and the site where to locate all the cranes. Okay, there's mobile cranes, but there's also cranes on top of each part of the steel as it's being erected. Now, if you may, or you can, you'll see that it looks pretty high. Now, if somebody said to me now, is that a 10-storey building, is that a 20-storey building? I can't tell you, and I couldn't tell you back then. But if you look closer, right below my chin, I'll try and point it out to you. That there is a 6-foot high man or figure. And there's one down beside the crane at the bottom right as you look at it. Another 6-foot man or figure. And that was just, I did that. I wasn't told to do that. I did that. Once I was finished, I thought that's one thing the chief draftsman will send the drawing back. Here, get rid of that. But it turned out he kept it because for the same line, the reason for I put it in, he thought it was very interesting. It was able to give anyone looking at it a size of scale for the whole overall drawing.